Hi there, this is Ron Rogers, and I want to tell you about my backwards entry into open cockpit aircraft flying. Now, I learned to fly in a Piper 140, paid for by the Air Force because I couldn't afford it otherwise, and then right into T-37s, T-38s. And I was a T-37 first instructor a while, and then I went out to the Air Force Flight Test Center in the T-38. That's the ED on the tail. It doesn't mean what you might think it means. It means Edwards. But anyway, I'm doing a maintenance, a functional check flight, what we call a maintenance flight, functional check flight. And we have a whole plethora of things that we go through and check on this. And the aircraft that I was taking up, they'd worked on the front canopy, replaced an engine, worked on some flight controls, and done various little things. And of course, you run through a complete functional check flight when you do one of these things. And one of the things you do is you check the canopy attach little dealy bobbers. Technical term, I know. Okay, they're called latches. Okay, and what they are, the yellow arrow points to the hole, the little slot they come out, and it's a little latch, kind of like this, that comes out, does a little over center. Okay, if you can see that. Okay, these technical aids here are wonderful. I know it does this little over center thing. And on the T-38 front canopy, there are 6 of these. And you where the red arrow is, you look down to this little eraser-sized hole, and you look through there for a little vertical stripe. That's the alignment stripe. That means that the hinge is properly aligned. The hook is properly aligned. It's got these 2 little bolts that they attach at the bottom of it, and it means it's properly aligned, and that's what you check for. Alrighty, and I checked all 6 of those. I was a little bit more limber back then, and I could actually move my head around to get to all the various points and see that, but they all checked fine. I took off, climb out. One of the first things you do is stability augmenter check, fine. Well, Edwards Special Use Airspace, I'm going to do an afterburner climb to the high altitude supersonic corridor to go through the supersonic part of the test. And as I do that, I'm about 300 knots after I complete the SAS check. And I put the aircraft in a burner. I'm at 4,000 feet, which is 2,000 feet above the desert. We had special use airspace, so you could go fast, and we all really enjoyed that. So I punched into burner. I start a slow roll, and we had one of these airspeed indicators. They use these aircraft for flight test and pacing and stuff, and it wasn't a typical T-38 airspeed indicator that goes from 0 to 713 knots in about the 8 o'clock position. This had a little barrel drum, and every time it rolled around, that was 100 knots with the big pointer, and it's fun because you can just watch this thing go up. It's real neat. And I did this roll, and just as I'm coming out at the bottom of the roll, about still 2,000 feet above the ground or so, maybe a little bit less, I'm coming up on 500 knots, 0.89 Mach. 500 knots is roughly 580 miles per hour. And just as I did that, I hit a little bit of turbulence, which probably caused a little bit of torsion of the aircraft, and the canopy separated. I mean, it departed the aircraft. It took both my checklist, my regular T-38 checklist and my FCF checklist on the other leg. It blew my mask off. I thought the airplane had exploded. This was my story for when I interviewed United. Had you have anything that, out of the ordinary and usual happen to you, an emergency, something like that, and I don't want to hear your radio didn't channelize, you military guys. And I said, well, yes, sir, I did have this one thing. I had a canopy separated at 500 knots. And the crusty old captain, who's probably good 20, 30 years younger than me now, goes, holy, I can't repeat it on the air, but the personnel guy next to him kind of jumped a little bit out of his seat, so I'm thinking he's like this. But anyway, the canopy separated. Well, I thought I was dead. The loudest noise I've ever heard in an airplane, things like that. About a quarter of a second went by, and I was still conscious, so I thought, well, maybe I better do something. Oh, and by the way, the tail number on that aircraft is 579, and I have one of my followers who does graphic arts. He actually put together this little thing for me, and actually it's on the shirts here. It's the tail number on this But I Digress shirt, and it's the tail number of the aircraft that had the canopy separate. And slight digression here. This aircraft actually later went out to the Navy Test Pilot School in Pax River, and due to a mismanagement, let's call it that way, by the IP, they landed and went off the end of the runway, and they both punched out. So my new canopy that they replaced after I lost this one. Oh, and the canopy was just destroyed. It was little pieces of all we could find. So they punched off those canopies. I think the aircraft has been repaired, but whatever. Okay, so anyway, here's the canopy there. That's what it looks like, because on these maintenance test flights, you fly it with the back unoccupied. These are all solo, and this is the canopy that separated. Now, there was an issue with the P-80, and the P-80 is kind of off the T-33. They're similar design. It's got a very flimsy canopy, and the T-38 canopy, anybody familiar with it, this is a flimsy canopy. And when I came back, a lot of the older people, I was met by the wing commander in that because of the situation. He thought it was fairly serious, but once I realized what was going on, got it under control, got a chase to look over the tail because I was worried the canopy might have hit the tail. Once it was all under control, it was really no big deal, but they seemed very concerned, and I didn't quite understand that. I didn't really ask any questions, but I was living to fight another day sort of thing. But about 20 years later, I got this book from Bob Hoover called Forever Flying, and I'm reading it, and he talks about the P-80 aircraft, and it has a flimsy canopy, and they were having the aircraft crash with the pilots decapitated and the canopy gone. It took them a while to figure out that if you weren't going perfectly straight with a flimsy canopy, and the canopy separated as it came up, it would sweep across the cockpit and decapitate the pilot. So I was giving a presentation at Science Experimental Test Pilots, and I told Bob Hoover that, I read his book and 20 years later got scared and finally understood what was going on. Oh, and the cause of the situation, when they worked on the canopy, they had replaced this front latch, and the mechanic had only finger tightened it. And he was supposed to tighten it to 150 inch-pounds, and he only finger tightened it, so it looked good when it closed, but once it got a little bit of a load where it shifted, it shifted, it unlocked, and they're set up when one goes, they all go because it thinks you're ejecting. And when that happened, the whole canopy went. So it wasn't my fault, because often if you lose a canopy in a T-38, it's on takeoff, and it's because you didn't get it latched properly. So that's usually a pilot error type of thing. And fortunately, I still have the accident report. It's an accident. It was classified as that because the canopy was machined out of a single piece of magnesium. This whole bow and everything supposedly was a single piece of magnesium, and this was back 50 years ago, and back then the canopy cost $26,000. So anyway, they got a new canopy. It took a while to find one. They got a new one. They put it on, and we decided I was going to refly it because I had flown it the first time, which was kind of interesting when you go through the test point that got your attention the first time. So I'm going to refly it, but we put Bobby Howard in the back seat there, who's the head test pilot and fighter operations out at Edwards at Test Ops, and he went in the back, and basically the deal was if the canopy came off again, which I sincerely hoped it would not do that, but if it came off again, he was just going to take the airplane and fly it back. Simple solution. I wouldn't even have to worry about anything because the mask was blown off. I got it back. I squawked emergency to get attention of the air traffic controller because I just talked to him to get clearance in the high altitude corridor. And it took me a while to find the mask, put it back on, coordinate the chase and stuff like that, but, let him know what's going on. So the deal was if something like that happened again, he would just take it and fly it back. Well, it was kind of interesting. A little later, mechanics are around. I'm getting ready to do another functional check flight, whole, different airplane, whole different situation. And one of the mechanics says, "Boy, I'd really like to go along with you." And I go, "Well, we're required to fly these single seat unless it's an unusual situation. But you being a mechanic, we might be able to get approval for you to go." And he thought, well, that's kind of cool. And then the other mechanic, who was much more familiar with functional check flights, start telling him what we did on these flights. And he got kind of pale and decided, well, he really didn't want to do that. Okay, well, that was my first exposure to open cockpit aircraft flying. It started at 500 knots, and I landed at just about 200 knots. I kept the speed up a little bit. We got a 15,000-foot runway at Edwards, so I'm not worried about it. I kept the speed up a little bit because I wasn't quite sure of all the aerodynamic characteristics with the canopy gone and if it affected anything. But so my first open cockpit experiment was 500 knots down to 200 knots. All right, I get out of the Air Force. I get hired by United Airlines, promptly furloughed. I go to work for Cessna Flight Test, and I got a little aerobatics school with a Citabra and decathlon. And Ed Merkel, who unfortunately now has passed away, great guy. He was a fighter pilot in the Air Force also. And he also an aerodynamicist. I worked with him actually both at Cessna and Boeing. We both went from Cessna over to Boeing. And he built what he called the Mark I here, which was an all-metal biplane with an all-movable tail that he designed himself. And it was just an absolute pleasure to fly. Actually, anybody familiar with the Crusader, the Cessna 303, which was supposed to replace the 310, he did the aerodynamics on that. And that thing, when I put down first notch of flaps on my 310, it balloons all over the place. I put down gear and flaps on the 303, and it was steady as a rock. He did a good job. But anyway, he says, hey, you want to go fly my biplane? And I go, yeah, that'd be fun. And he says, have you ever flown open cockpit before? And I go, yes, but never this slow. So he goes, what? So I explained the story to him. Anyway, we went up and flew a little bit, and we come back, and he says, well, you want to go fly solo? And I go, sure. Now, what you see now is a later version of the aircraft. Many years later, he had it painted. Okay, now this is Ed's original aircraft before he painted it, the Mark I, and it was polished aluminum. Of course, polished aluminum it's a lot of work to keep this thing going, but this is the one that I went up and flew with him. And we went up dual, and he gave me a checkout. Then he says, you want to fly it solo? And I go, sure, that sounds like fun. And okay, so I went up there, I flew it above the airfield, doing a bunch of aerobatics and stuff. He said, it looked like he had a fun time, came back. Now, I had an aerobatics school that I used a Citabra and decathlon in, and I told one of my students that Ed had let me fly his airplane solo, and he goes, really? And I goes, yeah. And he says, well, in the last 10 years, and he knew Ed, he says, Ed has only let a handful of people fly his airplane solo. So I thought, man, I'm pretty honored at that. Okay, well, this is Cessna Flight Test and that, and that was fun flying open cockpit. And after I got done teaching my son how to fly, I had a Cessna Cutlass, a 172 RG, and I wanted to have something fun to fly. And so I thought, well, I'd like to get something open cockpit. And I'm looking at a PT-20, a PT-21, which is kind of a cool airplane, used World War II trainer. It's got pretty good high sink rate. It'll come down on you when you pull the power, but it looked like fun to fly. Okay, it was supposed to be a little challenging for the World War II pilots to fly, a little bit more high performance, but it looked cool. So I looked at a couple of them, and I flew this one that had been beautifully restored. I mean, it was just immaculate. And I decided I wasn't interested in it. The price was a little bit high for what I was interested in paying for. And I decided that, well, I would keep looking. But then I heard about this accident. And yeah, Harrison Ford, he had a problem. Now, the guy who rebuilt it, I mean, he did a good job, but he might have, I don't know if he didn't get the engine quite right, or I'm not sure exactly who worked on it, but there's a little problem with the engine, and it quit on Harrison Ford, and he ended up landing in a golf course. But they kept talking about how beautifully restored this airplane was. Well, I found a picture, and right by the tail there is the N number in real small letters, and I looked it up, and it's the same one in my logbook. I had flown the aircraft that he later, took out there, because I'd heard it been sold to some guy out in the West Coast. Didn't know it was Harrison Ford, but it had been sold to some guy on the West Coast, and of course, he could easily afford a really reasonably high-priced, in my opinion, restored aircraft. And here's another picture of the Harrison Ford crash site. Now, the idea was I was going to get a PT-21 because I wanted something fun to fly. I'd gotten rid of the 172 RG. I'd taught my son how to fly. He's gone off to college. I'd got him his private commercial and instrument because I had a CFI MEI, which we didn't use at the time. But he's off to college, and I want something fun. Okay, well, my wife is talking to some local doctors out in her hometown in western Iowa, and going there in the Cutlass was 3 hours, and going in something like this, it just wasn't going to be cross country. And she goes, I don't, that doesn't sound good. But the doctor mentioned that he could get from Ottawa, which is her hometown, to DuPage, which is real close to Crystal Lake, in 2 hours. And she goes, my DuPage? And he goes, yeah. And she goes, you can do that in 2 hours? Okay, well, the PT-21 is going to go by the wayside. So I ended up getting a Cessna 310 Q model, had it for 15 years, went to the R model after that. But I call the 310 a PT-21 with a wife's influence. So until I got to the point where I retired from the airlines and I could now afford a second aircraft, even though it's when you retire, it's twice the husband and half the pay. But I had done a lot of rental properties and made some money there, so I had enough extra funds that I could actually afford two airplanes. So I start kind of looking around. Now, I also had the opportunity, guy who had the hangar from me, he offered me to fly this Baby Ace. And I kind of looked at that and I go, well, I'm not sure if I can fit in that. And then actually one of the mechanics out of the airport says, yeah, you don't want to fly that because if that thing turns over, you're going to be trapped and you won't be able to get out of it. So I go, yeah, I'm not interested in that. And of course, back in the day, airline pilots like to be able to feel the wind in their face. They didn't like this thing of being in enclosed, so the passengers could be enclosed, but they were going to be out in the slipstream so they could feel it. Thank God we don't do that anymore, because up at, 33,000 feet, you'd really be freezing your posterior off. Now, I didn't buy this one, wasn't interested in it all. $1.2 million price tag, which is way out of my budget. And also, you notice how bulky the fuselage is and kind of the small rudder there. The guys who flew it, the Waco Aircraft Company, a guy from Junkers, a German guy, wanted to do some work on this aircraft, have it as a option to sell. So he put this together, had it rebuilt, and these guys were flying it, the Waco people, the Waco pilots, and they said it was really a bear in crosswinds. Okay, well, I'm still looking for something to fly, and okay, well, this is kind of cool. PT-26, you could possibly go places. It could be instruments, and you could have the canopy closed or open, so that looked kind of cool. And I looked also at the PT-19. That looked pretty cool, but we had this one pilot, retired United guy, very active in EAAs. He's now passed away also, but he says, it's got a wood spar. And he said it's basically a bunch of termites holding hands that are keeping that thing together. And the cost to rebuild that spar, if you even found somebody who had the ability to do it, because it's a wood spar, if you had to rebuild it, was extremely expensive. So I'm going, maybe that's not something I want. And he was a little concerned about the structural integrity of these spars. So, okay, but I'm still interested. And I looked at a PT-23. Now that was cool. Open cockpit, radial engine, took the wife up in it. That was kind of neat. And I was looking at this one that had just been rebuilt by, you might recognize that guy there, EAA Paul Poberezny. It was his one rebuilt, and I looked at that. But the whole thing about the termites holding hands kind of dissuaded me. So I looked at this Vultee, and it had Vultee Vibrator, I think was the name of it. And that just, an airplane called Vultee, anything vibrator, just didn't win me over. But then, they're T-34 now. They had the spar issue where they couldn't do aerobatics anymore. And so my first flight in a T-34 was with the lead of the Lima Lima squadron, and he was a United pilot who was looking to retire, and he was looking for a replacement. And it's kind of funny, not having ever flown with the Lima Lima squadron, that he wanted to bring me in as their leader. But I flew it, and it was a fun airplane to fly and stuff like that. But I just wasn't that interested in a T-34 at the time because of the spar issue and stuff, and you couldn't do aerobatics in it, and I really liked doing aerobatics. So yeah, I looked at that, but and I flew with them, and it was fun flying formation in prop airplanes. And prop airplane formation is a lot different than jet, because with the prop, you really get fast response, where in a jet the response is a lot slower, but you have a lot more energy in a jet flying formation. It's a whole different ball game. But anyway, I decided, well, yeah, it wasn't really for me. It was going to be quite a endeavor to get into that position of flying with these guys, and especially taking over as lead. Also looked at a Stearman. I had a little issue with the hangar. I wanted to keep my 310. Now I was at the point where I could afford two airplanes. I wanted to keep my 310, but this one fit in my other hangar, the porta-port. So that became a factor. What could I put in the porta-port? And I did the little squares and moving things around, and the 310 and anything else, a Waco, a Stearman was not going to fit in there. So I decided that wasn't going to work. And the Stearman's got great history. Okay, that we got a great Stearman group around here. A United pilot that I know very well, Tom, headed the Stearman group for a long time. Extremely knowledgeable in it, but yeah, it was kind of heavy airplane. It wasn't as nice of an aerobatic airplane as I wanted. And I looked at the Great Lakes. Okay, this now I talk about it in another video. This one this was the company Great Lakes 21GL that Waco had up in Battle Creek, and they took people up and they gave them demo rides and stuff like this. And unfortunately, the guy who actually checked me out in the airplane was the instructor when a guy had a landing accident and destroyed the airplane. So this airplane is deceased. If you fly long enough, you'll have a list of airplanes that you've flown that no longer are in existence, but hopefully you still are. And I also looked at, we had a local guy who had, this is the airplane I went up and flew. And the interesting thing about this one was built out of Enid, Oklahoma back in the 70s. That's what I was. I went through pilot training in Enid, Oklahoma in T-37s and T-38s, and this airplane was most likely being built at the time out there, which is kind of interesting. But I was, all enamored with the Air Force, and I didn't have time to even think about anything else. But that we probably touched close to each other at the time. But my thought was, okay, it's an old airplane. The fabric's about 35 to 40 years old. I'm probably going to have it recovered. And it was just an old airplane. The price was good, but it was an old airplane, and I ended up buying well, I don't want to get ahead of my story here too much. But I also looked at the Waco, and the hangar arrangement wouldn't work with that either, although that I love the radial engine. But the other thing is, it's not as good of an aerobatic airplane. It's heavy. And the other thing is, with the carburetor on that, if you get negative G's, the engine can quit. And I go, well, I'm used to flying an airplane that didn't have an inverted fuel system, and the engine quits during the roll, and you come back out and it restarts, and go, no. The float can jam, and you won't get the engine restarted. So I go, that doesn't sound too exciting. Okay, and it really gets bad. Okay, I even looked at gyrocopters there. My wife and I went out and we took some demo flights in a couple of these. Very interesting, very fun, a little more vibration than I cared for. Interesting to fly, but okay, I'm not going to do that. But the Great Lakes is a really cool airplane, and it has a great history. It was the airplane before the pits. Okay, and I have virtually no time in a pits, and when I was getting into my 70s, and I'll talk about some of these age issues in some other videos, but the insurance company, basically, they didn't even want to talk to me about the insurance rate. Well, they did, but the rate was so astronomical that, yeah, that wasn't going to fly. The Great Lakes actually had a much better accident history than the pits for some strange reason. And the insurance on that was half of what it was to insure a pit. So I go, the Great Lakes was the aerobatic airplane before the pits came along. And it's a great flying airplane. Really nice. Good control power. Much more control effectiveness than the Stauber Decathlon. But if you can fly aerobatics in a Stauber Decathlon, you can fly aerobatics in anything, because the controls are heavy in the Decathlon and unresponsive compared to a Great Lakes. Now, a couple things that are going to stay records. Tex holds the record for consecutive outside loops. He did this in 1931, 131 outside loops in 1931. This record has remained unbroken, and it, as far as I'm concerned, can remain unbroken, because I'm not even going to come close to challenging that. Now, Dorothy Hester, she did 62 continuous consecutive outside loops back in 1931 also. That must have been the thing to do in 1931, was outside loops. And just between you and me, not my favorite maneuver. Outside spins inverted spins are bad enough. But outside loops, they're not kind of my favorite, especially open cockpit. I mean, you're really hanging out there. You really are. But okay, I'm retired. Finances aren't in too bad a shape, so I can now afford 2 airplanes. So I have them built. It was built in 2022. 727 was one of my favorite airplanes, that and the 777, and KR is my wife's initials. Always have tie-in with your wife. It really helps you out. So I now have my open cockpit airplane, and I fly aerobatics in it, and I just have a great time. So that is my long, torturous route to open cockpit aircraft flying. I hope you found it interesting and enjoyable. Thanks for watching.